that the Sharm el-Sheikh joint work on agriculture and food security session is running for quite a while. So I think that a couple of the people we had speaking may or may not be able to make it. But let's kick off. I would like to thank everyone for coming. My name is Kelly Dent. I'm the Global Director of External Engagement at World Animal Protection. World Animal Protection is a global organisation with 12 offices across the global north and south. So the first question that many people ask is, why are we as an animal welfare organisation at the climate negotiations? Some people think that the protection of animals is somehow separate to the goals of the Paris Agreement. My answer to them is we'll never be able to stop global warming unless the needs and roles of animals, along with humans and the environment, are also considered. We're now in the absurd situation where the forest habitats of animals are being destroyed to produce feed that keeps cruel factory farms running. These farms inflict untold suffering on billions of animals each year. They're not only cruel, they're huge polluters and climate culprits that must be tackled. So when I speak, I will outline some more information about the new report that we're launching today, but I want to give you one statistic to ponder until we get to that, and that is we estimate that factory farming from the global north alone was responsible for about $8 billion in damage caused by recent extreme weather events in Asia, Africa, and in South America. So to examine the impact of industrial farming, I'm really delighted to be joined by two co-hosting organisations today. So along with World Animal Protection, we have our two co-hosts, HEDA and Four Paws, and I'll introduce these panellists separately, but I want to acknowledge the co-hosts of the session first. So HEDA is the Human and Environmental Development Agenda Resource Centre. It's a non-government and non-partisan human rights and development organisation. They work with others to advocate for fair economic and climate deals for Africa, in particular for small-scale farmers. Four Paws is a global animal welfare organisation that advocates for a world where humans treat animals with respect, empathy and understanding. As I said before, we were planning to have the honour of being joined by two government representatives from Senegal and Uganda, Mr. Lamine Diatta, the Climate Policy Officer at the Senegalese Ministry of Environment, Sustainable Development and Ecological Transition. However, I'm not sure that we will have them here. And then lastly, it's a great privilege to have Nemo Bassi join us. Nemo is a Nigerian architect, environmental activist, author and poet who has previously chaired Friends of the Earth International. However, you sitting here are our most important speakers for today. So get ready to ask your questions and to have a discussion. We're going to allow about 40 minutes at the end for a discussion. So yes, be prepared with your questions. So during the 2022 General Assembly, the UN Chief, Antonio Guterres, described loss and damage as a fundamental question of climate justice, international solidarity and trust, adding that polluters must pay because vulnerable countries need meaningful action. We believe that it's the responsibility of the biggest polluters to be held accountable for the damages they have caused. So I'm going to introduce Suleiman Agribabu, and while I'm doing that, if I could ask our tech people please to bring up presentation number 1. So I would like to welcome Suleiman Agribabu, Executive Secretary of HEDA, the Human and Environmental Development Agenda Resource Centre. Suleiman is a social engineer and environmental, food and climate justice advocate. He has studied environment, human rights and public policy and international affairs. So welcome, Suleiman. You have the floor.
All right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and welcome to my co-panelists as well. I think the introduction is quite sufficient, so I'll just dive into my presentation. So the topic of my presentation is how multi-billion-dollar industrial animal farming by and money fleecing to the global north compound climate woes for communities and farmers in Africa. I want us to keep in view the climate paradox, which is that the part of the world that is least responsible, for historic emissions and current per capita emission is the one that is worst impacted by the realities of climate change. It's also the region that is least equipped to cope and least able to bounce back after climate disasters. It's also the region that is poor, the way it is presented, but we know that it is rich in what is reserved, but it's poor and continue to be ripped of her natural assets. And finally, to keep in mind is that this is the region that has the least voice when it comes to the climate decision table, and it's mostly, rather than being a participant of the new economic opportunities put up by climate change, is mostly just another situation of dumping ground. So that would be my opening remarks to go into this. And of course, the whole essence of our gathering here is the shared understanding that climate change, like all other environmental concerns, have no boundaries. So things happen, things occasioned in one part of the world has impacts on other parts of the world. And unfortunately, continents like Africa happen to bear the brunt of this. And some of the drivers of the emissions that lead to global warming and, of course, climate change that we're witnessing, one of the major ones will be agriculture. So here we say anthropogenic climate change is caused by multiple climate pollutants with carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrogen oxide, with the largest individual contribution to global warming. Agriculture and food production is associated with all three of these gases, but direct agricultural emissions are usually being dominated in methane and nitric oxide. The global food system is responsible for between 21 to 37% of annual emissions, and the production of animal products is innately tied with the environmental degradation in various forms, increasing greenhouse gas emissions, requiring deforestation, using unsustainable amount of the Earth's limited freshwater supply, and contaminating freshwater that is left over. Industrial scale animal production is a major climate culprit. As industrial agriculture gains in the global north and in some other parts of the world where intense industrial agriculture, intense animal production exists, the reverse impacts on some other parts of the world, including countries in Africa, including communities, some of which I visited before coming here, results in climate extremes. Sometimes it comes in form of drought, sometimes in form of flooding, and all sorts of environmental realities. Last year in Nigeria, we had a major flooding, which, according to UNICEF, put 1.5 million children at risk. According to the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, cost the country $9 billion. And in terms of fatality, over 600 citizens were killed and over 1.6 million were displaced due to the flooding that ensued from that. And then there are other problems that we don't like to discuss. It's almost like a taboo, but it's reality. It's not on the table here at the UNFCCC. Unfortunately, where it should be on the table at the next, in a couple of days, the UNCAC, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, will start in Atlanta. Where it should be on the table is not on the table, and that is that the fact that you have, according to UNCTAD here, Africa loses about $88.6 billion, or 3.7% of its GDP annually, to what? Illicit financial flow. Why are we bringing this to the table? Because really, climate debt payment is almost becoming a scam. You know, yes, we clapped, loss and damage fund has been, okay, it's coming up, but we've seen the paltry amount coming in. It's not anywhere near what is required. But the bigger picture for some of us is the fact that what Africa has and should use to, as first help for itself, you know, to build resilience, to cope with realities of climate change, to climb out, is also being fleeced out of the continent to come the part of the world that already has enjoyed so much. Corruption, which our people are also guilty of, our leaders, our corporate individuals are guilty of, is a major problem. But then we also have the problem of stolen assets. People fleece money from Africa and come and invest. This country, Dubai, is hosting so many properties of people who have stolen from Africa to find safe. And it's the same for London, it's the same for the US, and so many other parts of, you know, the developed world, where stolen assets from Africa find solace, find safe haven. And then there's the problem of unfair global trade. So, and this is directly linked to even industrial agriculture, because the West said to us, you don't have to subsidize anything. But then the same West subsidizes its agriculture and then asks us to sign on to some WTO agreement that opens our market and makes it difficult for our own agricultural product to get to the West. And the ones that goes to the West don't go on our terms, not cocoa, not cashew. So those farmers who grow cocoa cannot afford chocolates. And these are some of the realities. So that is why this side of the conversation is also important. The resources that Africa has, that it needs to help itself out of the situation we find ourselves, is also still being stolen out of the continent through illicit financial flows, through unfair trade, through corruption, and this must be addressed because it appears that paying climate debts is probably never going to happen. So in this light, I want to say that the following things need to be put on the table and needs to be considered as a matter of urgency. One is that the fleecing of Africa's resources need to stop. And when you look at the negotiation at UNCAC, where they are campaigning that there should be a clause that puts the onus of responsibility to return stolen assets back to Africa on the countries where these assets find safe haven, the same countries who are unable to pay their climate debt so that Africa can breathe are the same ones blocking that clause for becoming an instrument. Repatriation of stolen assets. A global emergency needs to be declared on this. The continent, of course, must fight corruption because no resources leaves Africa without the connivance, of Africans. Give the continent value for our resources. Let us be the one in control of the resources, be it lithium, be it cocoa, be it cashew. Let Africans be the ones, and they pay climate debt. More importantly, reduce emission from industrial animal production, because no matter what Africa earns, no matter how rich it becomes, if climate change continues to be a threat, there's no progress for Africa and there'll be no progress for humanity. I'd like to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Suleiman. Thank you for outlining the responsibility of global North agribusinesses for climate disasters in the global South. Thank you very much. I'd also just like to acknowledge that Dr. Fred Kabago, Assistant Commissioner at the Ugandan Ministry of Agriculture, Animal Industry and Fisheries, has been able to join us. So welcome. I will introduce you more formally when you speak, but I just wanted to acknowledge that you had joined us. If I could have up, while I'm introducing the video, please. The video, just get ready to play it. I'll let you know when to play. So next up, I will now show a video that World Animal Protection produced that outlines the impact of industrial farming on farmers in some African countries. And this is being released right now. So enjoy. If we could have that.
Across our fragile planet, farmers work the land to put food on our tables. In the global south, independent smallholder farmers provide affordable food for their communities, harvesting food from high-welfare animals and sustainable crops. Up to 80% of food in sub-Saharan Africa is produced in this way. Elsewhere, industrial factory farms dominate. Caged animals live in unimaginably cruel conditions and are dosed with drugs to stave off diseases, ensuring the mass production never ends and profits flow. Swaths of wild habitat are destroyed to plant crops for animal feed, and the journey from factory farm to plate pumps more than 6 trillion tons of emissions into the atmosphere annually. From India and Pakistan to Mongolia and the Amazon and across Africa, food security and social stability are threatened by droughts, floods, wildfires, extreme temperatures, crop failure, and death of livestock. And things are getting worse. Factory farming accounts for 11% of global greenhouse emissions, and by 2050 will cause over $100 billion a year in damage. The devastating effect of factory farms, especially in developing countries, has been difficult to gauge until now. Groundbreaking research by World Animal Protection shows how the livelihoods of smallholder farmers and the communities they serve are being decimated by industrial processes in far-off countries. Instead of expanding industrial farming methods, we can learn from farmers like John Kamathi and his wife Belize. The developed global north needs to farm responsibly. We must transition to humane and sustainable food production, eat less meat and more plant-based foods. We must end factory farming, because there is a cleaner, fairer, cruelty-free way to feed the world.
Thank you. If I could have presentation number 2 up now, please. And now's the most tricky part of this. I have to make sure I press the clicker properly. What I'm going to do now is just spend a few moments highlighting the scope of the research that was referred to in the small film that you just saw, a video presentation. So you can see here a graph that's, I think, probably familiar to many of you. We know that 2023 has been a year of climate extremes, with temperature records that have been tumbling across the world. And we know that human activities are driving these temperature records and the intensity and frequency of climate-induced weather events. And this has included an increase in frequency and intensity of droughts, heat waves, wildfires and storms, which in turn is exacerbating global inequality and hunger. So this is just a very a quick snapshot of the scale and impacts of factory farming. So we know factory farming continues to expand around the world, and this is in response to urbanisation, a growing population and a growing demand for meat. But this growth comes with a significant cost to our environment, our climate, biodiversity, health, and to billions of animals whose habitats are destroyed and those who are caught up inside factory farms. So there's an increased recognition that the climate-related impacts of producing more than 80 billion land animals for food annually, over 70% of which are reared in factory farms, increases the frequency and impact of climate-related weather events around the world. And these are felt by the poorest and the most vulnerable countries, particularly those in the global south. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the scope of research or the methodology because I want to get to some of the findings, but I will just outline briefly the scope and the methodology. So essentially what our research did was calculated the proportion of total greenhouse gas emissions that come from factory farming, and then we looked at them across the global north and the global south. So the global north we took is around, it was 34 countries. The global south we used the Brandt line definition, but we included China in that. So yeah, it was included there. And then what we did was we then attributed a portion of the increased frequency and intensity of those climate-related disasters that impacted the global south to the greenhouse gas emissions caused by factory farming. Now, this is new work, and the uniqueness of this work is less in the actual numbers, because attribution science, as we know, is still in its very early stages, but it's more in the ability that we are able to link the impacts of factory farming emissions to economic loss and damage, particularly in the global south. Now, some of the statistics we used are probably vast underestimates. And as I said, attribution science is in its infancy. However, the pattern is clear. The report also includes lived experience of farming communities, which you saw in the video. And there's more in the report. And then we've got some recommendations for policymakers. I pretty much said what was on that methodology slide when I was talking about the scope. So I'll just, I can come back to that at a later, but I think I've pretty much said everything that is on that slide. So moving on, what we did was we looked at, in terms of the calculations that we did for the research, we essentially were able to determine that around 11% of industrial animal agriculture, contributes to around 11% of global emissions across the sectors. And basically, we then saw that because animal agriculture contributes 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions, we then divided that between the north and the south and saw that the global north contributes about 4.6% of that 11% to greenhouse gas emissions, so factory farms in the global north. And we also calculated about looking at the attribution of 13 or 15 studies across the 3 years, where we could look at the economic costs of the impact of climate-related disasters. We were then able to calculate about $8.6 billion worth of damage that factory farms in the global north are responsible for in the global south, in particular Africa, Asia and South America. I'm not going to talk to this slide because essentially this slide was basically covered in the presentation that you saw at the beginning. So I've talked to about the costs there. What we do want to make the point here is that governments are left to pay the bill while factory farming corporate giants are enjoying record profits. And it's really important that we do see world leaders acknowledge factory farming is a hidden climate culprit, and we need to see a shift to support from factory farming towards humane and sustainable food systems. So this is really important for us. So in terms of recommendations that the research covers, it makes the following recommendations a next step. So we want to see a stop to supporting factory farming systems and the continued industrialisation of livestock systems, which makes a significant contribution to global warming. We want to see a moratorium on any new factory farms in the global south and in Africa in particular. There's a need to stop factory farms from displacing small-scale producers, pastoral livestock systems that actually support communities and millions of livelihoods and employ very large amounts, percentages of women. So we also want to see national plans to support a just transition away from industrialised livestock production towards agroecological systems that produce sustainable plant-based foods and fewer farmed animals in high welfare environments. The Loss and Damage Fund, which has been established now, needs sufficient money to actually be able to make sure that there's enough financing for the loss and damage that's been caused, through various, including factory farms in the global north. We would like to see some of these, the large companies actually contributing to the Loss and Damage Fund. And of course, as has been said, we want to see an end to agricultural subsidies that are going towards factory farming, and we want to see those going towards a more humane and sustainable protein. So I will stop there, and what I'm going to do is ask the tech people to upload the next speech, which is number 3. And Nemo, I need to ask you to press that green button. You'll see your slides will come up there. But I'll introduce you first. So I would like to invite Nemo Bassi to speak. He's the director of the ecological think tank Health of Mother Earth Foundation, which promotes environmental justice and food sovereignty in Africa. He serves on the advisory board of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and was chair of Friends of the Earth International from 2008 to 2012. His books include To Cook a Continent, Destructive Extraction and the Climate Crisis in Africa, and Oil Politics, Echoes of Ecological War. So Nemo, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. It's really a great privilege to be on this panel talking about the impacts of industrial farming and why it has to be stopped. And I would just like to preface my brief presentation saying that really this is something that needs to be done, and very urgently, because the world is fed by small-scale farmers, and industrial farming mostly produces food either for machines or a lot of it goes to waste. And so investment in that sector depends on a whole lot of subsidies, and it leads to the proliferation of chemicals for herbicides, pesticides, destroying soil, air, water, everything, and in the pretext that is feeding us. And then when it's said that agriculture contributes a whole lot of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, it's never stipulated what kind of agriculture. And that should be made very clear that it's industrial agriculture that's a culprit because it's built on the petroleum philosophy, petroleum civilization. And so we're here at the COP, we hear a lot of talks about decarbonization when we should be talking about depetrolization. The world has to really, really quickly shift away from fossil fuels. We hear a lot of talk about that happily, but we don't know what will come out at the end of the day. So one of the great highlights of this COP is loss and damage. And surprisingly, I must say, it came up on the very first day and got adopted. And so applause, 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 applause. But how much came into the pot? That is when the rubber meets the tarmac. We got the host country pledging 100 million, which was most unexpected, because we expected that loss and damage by definition is a responsibility of those who are historically accountable for the damage to the climate, for undue exploitation, from almost cannibal economic relationships, where everything is taken from vulnerable countries and people are left to battle to survive the flood and survive the drought, get drowned in the Mediterranean Sea and get killed or die of thirst in the Sahara Desert. But here we are having the host country put that money. What does it mean for this country to be the first to put a big amount of money in the hierarchies that we saw yesterday, at the big amount of money on the table, followed by Germany, followed by the EU. And the US put a miserly $17 million on the table for loss and damage. We always thought that the COP itself was lost and damaged because the COP has been backsliding for many years. Rather than requiring definite emissions cut requirement from the polluting countries, industrialized countries, here we are, everybody do whatever you feel like doing. They call it NDCs, nationally determined contributions. So whatever is convenient for your country, you do it. After a few years, you come up for stock take, you tell us you've done it or you've not done it. And the last stock take by the United Nations Environment Program showed that if the world does, if countries do what they said they're going to do, we're heading for 2.9 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. That shows how defective, ineffective, and wrong the NDC idea is. The world cannot fight climate change on a voluntary emissions reduction basis. It has to be based on historical responsibility and current responsibilities. And if we just want to go the way we're going, hopefully we'll get back to another COP next year. Otherwise, right now we're already beyond 1.1 degrees Celsius, and UNEP says we're heading for 2.9 degrees Celsius. At 1.1, we already have a lot of crises. And so how are we going to move to, if we move to 2.9, who would survive as a global average? And if you have 2.9 or 3 degrees Celsius as global average, Africa can be sure of about 8 degrees Celsius, or not 8, I exaggerate a little bit, permit me. It's okay to exaggerate when something really hits you very hard. If global average is 3, Africa will be talking about 4.5 at a minimum as an average across the continent. And that will make the continent unlivable. Many parts of the world will be uninhabitable. And so when the United Nations Secretary General says that the world has to reverse course, the countries have to pay attention to that because it's really important. So loss and damage should be payment for irreparable damage caused by climate change, and the funding should be done to help tackle the crisis that we're facing. Now, the problem has always been money. Right from Copenhagen, when voluntary emissions regime came into being and the Paris Agreement consolidated it, the first was for a few years, we're going to get 10 billion per year. That never happened. Then from 2020, 100 billion a year, it did not happen. There's a rumor that it may have happened last year. We have not seen the evidence that this happened last year. But look at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries. Their annual budget is about 1.2 trillion US dollars, not billion, trillion US dollars. Trillion US dollars. And that would meet a lot of the needs that we're talking about. Now, about $2 trillion is the net financial flow from the global south to the global north every year. The net financial flow, $2 trillion. This has been documented by, of course, the source is right there on the screen, Global Financial Integrity Group, so you can check it online. From Africa, some years ago, it was estimated about 192 billion US dollars goes out of, 192 billion goes out of Africa every single year. We already heard that from the first presentation about the corruption and everything, tax havens and that. Now, the World Bank is also going to be housing the loss and damage fund. And a whole lot of that will go into what you may call service charge, because the World Bank needs a lot of money to run. Can you imagine that? The World Bank that has wrecked the world's economy. The World Bank is not a World Bank. It's just a misnomer. It's an instrument of control, an instrument of wrecking other economies that they don't have equal voices on the table. And so putting the funding for loss and damage with the World Bank is already a fait accompli for the next 4 years, but that is a big minus to how the funds would be managed. Now, the whole scenario of the COP, Conference of Parties, the way it's gone on voluntary basis, the discussion on carbon offsetting and so on and so forth, places a lot of countries in the global south at big risk. Right now, there's a continent going on in Africa, a rush for African land. Some countries are ceding up to 25% of their land to some rich, powerful groups who are paying to use them for carbon offsetting, carbon credits. And this is going to mean displacement of communities. It's going to mean people being cut off from their natural resources. Farming is going to be affected seriously, and food production is going to become more difficult on the continent. And so when we talk about carbon offsetting and carbon credits and carbon trade, African countries are applauding this. In fact, the president of Kenya says it's a gold mine, more or less, for the country. But we don't count the cost. How much is going to cost the food production? How much is it going to cost the local communities? And then even renewable energy, with just transition. Without the just in front of the transition can be very harmful. So justice is critical. If you're going to get critical raw materials, from whose community, from whose land, on what conditions, and what will be the nature of the land when you finish extracting what you need to extract. We're already seeing the crisis communities are facing in Congo. In my country, some lithium is being mined in the Federal Capital Territory right in Abuja, and communities are already complaining about that. We're having this crisis in Latin America, and it's something that we need to talk about. I'm winding down, thank you. So where is the money coming from for loss and damage? I think this is a question that I've already touched on slightly. If the NATO countries spend 1.2 as their annual budget, and they are determined to do this because they're determined to have war somewhere, there must be war. If it's not in Ukraine, it's going to be in Palestine or somewhere else. There's going to be a lot of weapons needed. And, it costs money. Weapons cost money. But climate resilience doesn't cost money. Nobody wants to put money on the table to help people survive the climate crisis, which the people did not cause. And so this is a big, 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 serious crisis. If the world would listen, if you can listen to our humanity and learn solidarity instead of competition, learn cooperation instead of warfare, there will be enough funds to help the world turn the tide from destructive extraction and from destructive relationships. There will be debt cancellation, there will be money for ecological debt, which was mentioned earlier, which can be paid for historical damage that the world has suffered, and of course payment for historical plunder, exploitation, and so on and so forth. I could have said a lot about this, but I think I'm going to hang it there. We have to leave fossil fuels in the ground, and we have enough brains to move away from fossils and relate in a way that is in sync with nature, support agroecology, farming with nature, which farmers tell us, and we believe them, agroecology cools the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nemo. If we can bring up presentation number 4, thank you, while I introduce, or just before I do introduce Silawi, Shivambu, I'd just also like to acknowledge that we've also now been joined by Mr. Lamine Diata. Thank you very much and welcome. I will introduce you when we come to you, but I just wanted to acknowledge that you had been able to join us. To Nemo, thank you for your message on the importance of loss and damage and how contributions need to come from polluters right across the supply chain. So I'd like to welcome Celine Shimbabu from Four Paws. Silawi, is a climate justice activist based in South Africa. She's actively involved in policy making, advocacy and diplomacy. She's currently the campaigns officer for climate and pandemics in animal welfare at Four Paws in South Africa. Have you got the clicker? Yes, yeah. She has the clicker. Over to you, Silawi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for the introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shivambu, and today's presentation will really just be a case study of all the, the issues all of our speakers have already touched on. But this is a case study now focusing on animals in South Africa and, even in Africa. And I titled the name of the presentation, Live Kinder for Farm Animals. I think in a world where, such big meetings are constantly occurring, and big minds and experts in academia meets to try and figure out how do we live better for the people, for the planet, and most importantly for the animals. And as for Poor South Africa, we believe that living kinder for farm animals is a call that we're making to industries, a call that we're making to people, and a call that we're making as well to the government. With global warming is already, having a huge impact in South Africa. And South Africa is one of the countries that have been described as a water scarce country. And this is because, based on current projections that the country will exceed its limit of economically viable land-based water resources by 2050. And also changes in rain pattern, if it rains too much or it rains, too little, and when it does rain too much, it has a lot of, impact in the country, and also increased, evaporation rates and other factors affecting water scarcity can be attributed to climate change. But most importantly, other dangerous impact that we have seen that are associated with climate change in South Africa have been, higher temperatures. Our summers are a bit too hot, and increased pest distribution ranges, zoonotic diseases, and changes in diseases as well, as we've seen with the avian flu breakout in South Africa in the recent months, and also reduced yield and partial shift in optimum growing regions. But what does this, really mean for animals? It means that South Africa relies heavily on animal protein, for one, to feed its growing population of approximately 60 million inhabitants, and leading to an increase in demand for and the consumption of animal products over the last few decades. Now, to contextualize all of this is that in the context with difficulties associated with food security and limited resources, this demand has then led to a rapid industrialization with the proliferation of factory farms as well. These systems are dramatically different from the historical African agricultural system where animals were free to roam, outside and forage across vast areas and experience natural behaviors. Instead, this has then reduced, has caused a reduction in free-range livestock and a drastic increase in the number of animals that are farmed, of course, for, a quicker, in a quicker time span, with, of course, devastating impacts to animals. Animal production also continues to grow dramatically, growing, which is supported by government through subsidies and policies such as the Poultry Master Plan, which I will touch on later. Meanwhile, inadequate regulation oversight has been seen in a lot of factory farms and abattoirs in South Africa, and an enforcement of exhibits its harms on animals. Before industrialized animal agriculture became further entrenched in South Africa, it is important for us to, right now take a step back to understand and assess holistically these systems. Now, why do we need a kind of future? Animal agriculture has an extremely high environmental price tag, the environmental cost of just your meal, disproportionately, affecting the most vulnerable members of our society. The growing trend in industrial agriculture is especially bad for climate and the environment. And this is because the industry uses the most water in the country, which is already a water scarce country, with the largest, sorry, I forgot to click. Yeah, with the largest consumption coming from animal farming. About 80% of South Africa's land is devoted to agriculture, with about 69% used for grazing on, agricultural resources. Overgrazing and changes in land utilization has led to soil and bank erosion, which as well then, leads to installation of rivers. Factory farms prioritize profit over animal welfare and have a daring consequences on animals and on public health. For example, the rise of zoonotic diseases. And earlier this year, on World Zoonotic Day in South Africa, we released a report spotlighting zoonotic diseases in South Africa, another pandemic that we should look forward to. The emergence of such risk calls for an urgent, ambitious actions to ensure the resilience of South Africa's agricultural sector through adaptation of climate change impacts. Destructive initiatives like the Poultry Master Plan must be stopped. So, what is the Poultry Master Plan in South Africa? Currently, South Africa has the highest rate of meat consumption in the whole of Africa. The consumption of chicken, beef, lamb, and pork has risen since the 1970s, where previously maize and bread have played a more important role in both the economy and diet. Annually, the nation kills over 1 billion chickens alone, or approximately 20 million birds a week, making it one of the world's leading consumers of chicken. Stakeholders, including government, believe the industry can expand further, and to achieve this, they've then poured in large investment and incentives are given to processing facilities and farms. For instance, the government, through initiatives such as the Poultry Master Plan, then aim to expand the local production and drive domestic demand as well as exports. In June 2021, our Department of Trade and Industry reported that it already created an increase in 1 million birds production capacity per week. And what this means for import trends in South Africa is that South Africa still is the largest net importer of poultry, helping maintain competition that keeps the local prices low. South Africa has imported over 1.3 billion in poultry in Q2 in 2022. The Poultry Master Plan has 5 pillars with the commitments from stakeholders to achieve the necessary reforms. And this means expanding and improving local production, driving domestic demand, increasing focus on exports, enhancing regulatory framework, and also ensuring compliance, trade measures to ensure the local industry. But now, as for pause, we then call on industries and for the further industrialization of animal farming sector to be stopped. And how we want to go about this is for policymakers and market players to take steps to abandon the cruel practices and provide species-appropriate farming conditions under more sustainable systems based on pastoralism and agri-ecological principles, and also stop subsidizing industrial farming and similar incentives such as government-funded meat and dairy PRs that we have seen. And farming subsidies must be used to enable the transition towards a less animal farmed under industrial conditions. And most importantly, and the reason why 4 pauses at COP is to end factory farming, shifting away from harmful production systems towards resilient and sustainable farming systems in order to feed Africa's growing population sustainably and humanely. Thank you.
Thank you, Salawi. So we don't have PowerPoint presentations for the next 2, so I'm just letting the tech people know. Thank you. So now I would, so Salawi, thank you for outlining 4 Paws work, campaigning to stop the expansion of factory farming across African countries, and particularly the poultry plan as well. So what I would like to do now, it's my great pleasure to invite Mr. Lamine Diata to speak. He is the Program Officer in charge of matters related to agriculture, forestry and other land use at the Climate Change Ministry of Environment, Sustainable Development and Ecological Transition, That's a very long name to put on your business card, in Senegal. He's the climate change negotiator on matters related to agriculture. And thank you so much. I know you're very busy at these negotiations and you've come directly from the meeting over the Sharm el-Sheikh joint plan. So thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I apologize, I don't retain your name because I'm just from a negotiation room. And it's a pleasure for me to share experience from Senegal, which is one of the Sahelian country. So for those who know the Sahel, when I say Sahel, minds can go to the drought and very bad ecological conditions sometimes. And in those conditions, rainfalls are very, very scarce, and livestock becomes sometimes the only way for people to stay in some areas. And as you know, in our country, sometimes we are faced on the matter of migrations, but in some areas, those areas are still keeping lives and keeping hopes is thanks to livestock. And we have three types of livestock in our countries. We have what we call pastoralism, people moving from an area to another one depending on the ecological conditions. And we have what we call the agro-pastoral systems, those ones using crops and sometimes forest areas, grazing areas together. And we have a little bit what we can call a house boundary. But house boundary livestock in our countries is so limited. It is predominated by the poultry sector. So for the first one, like pastoralism, it's a very important one because in the northern part of Senegal, life is so difficult, it's very hot, and ecosystems are not so developed. So the only way sometimes to develop this part is through livestock. And we have this part that is classified as silver pastoral zone. And in this zone, it's like when we are saying we are dealing with Maasai in Kenya. So in this area also our stewards are these livestock people. And livestock is playing a very important role in terms of protein feeding in Senegal. And in those areas, they don't have rivers, they don't have ocean. So sometimes access to protein are very difficult. And if it is still possible, it's thanks to livestock. And livestock also is very important in this area because we are not like some countries where we have some grazing zones. Our livestock is conducted in forestry area. And those livestock, cattle contribute a lot on renewable of vegetation because sometimes in arid area, the rain is not so important and we have some plant seeds, they need a lot of water to grow up. But when they go through the animal digest systems, it became very easy for those plants to have seeds and then to grow up. And in agro-pastoral systems also it's very important because we have sometimes some offset, some win-win system between farmers and livestock people. So livestock people can come in some part of the year where we have not crops, and they can stay in the farms where they contribute to fertilize lands, and they can sometimes exchange with those people, local people, to give milk and to stay. And in this area, when you see the most part of Senegal where we are cropping, it's in parklands. We combine both trees and crops. And those crops like Federbia albida, what we call acacias, when they are there, it's thanks to livestock. So sometimes in those cropping cropland, all trees we find there, it's thanks to livestock. Without livestock, we are not going to have such kind of trees because for those seeds to grow up, it's very difficult. You need to go through some chemical process, but with livestock, this one is going to be, it's possible. So you can imagine in all this area, all these trees, what they are sequestering as carbon. That's why now we are thinking, when we say livestock, people sometimes think to lot of emissions. But if this livestock is combined to forestry area and trees, sometimes emissions are offset by carbon sequestration. And we have one project now ongoing in Senegal, which is showing that in some livestock system, we have more carbon sequestration per year than emission. And this one is very, very important for us because in our climate policies, when we are seeking for money, for fund for livestock, they are saying, no, we cannot fund livestock because this sector is very, very high emitting one. But with these research findings, we are showing that in some areas, like in our countries, it's like in some Sahelian area, livestock does not all times means lot of emissions because we are not in a house boundary system when cattle are kept in somewhere. We deal with a lot of manure. For this one, livestock is conducted in agro-pastoral area, so we can offset sometimes emission with what we call carbon sequestration. So these livestock systems are very vulnerable because we are in a Sahelian semi-arid area where everything relies on rainfalls, and rainfalls are becoming very scarcity now. And our livestock is facing water scarcity. And land degradation also is something very important in West Africa, especially in our Sahelian area. And that land degradation has a lot of influence on our grazing lands because these grass are not growing so well with climate variability. And also the content and the nutrition of those grazing land are changing with climate change. So we need sometimes this support to think about animal food security. We are talking a lot about human food security, but in this area, animal food security is very important. That's why this component is now a key one in our livestock policy area. And without this emission area, we have also some best practices in this in the livestock ecosystem. It's like what we are calling pastoral units. In this pastoral unit, people in some area they come together, some villages around one how we call it, water tower. So they use the space in a sustainable manner, and they are managing the natural resources. Land degradation is reduced. And now they are also protecting trees. So these trees are adding some folder, and we have carbon sequestration. So with these pastoral units, we are now in a position now to say in our countries, we can now seek for fund for this sector, knowing that it is not going to increase this one. We have a lot of others practices like wildfire control, because wildfire also is something, wildfire is very important in our countries, and we have hectares of hectares burning each year. But in this area, as people know that this fire is not good for their cattle, they are managing fire in a sustainable manner. And that one benefit to women, because women also in this area are a very key component, and they are having their livelihoods on what we call non-timber forest product. And when these livestock people are keeping the area without fire, that benefit to women, and also are investing a lot in their children education. So I want not to be so far, and I think that this contributes a lot in your discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very, very useful to hear the overview of some of the aspects that the Senegalese government is dealing with in terms of making sure that food systems are secure for the future. And interesting when you were talking about the existence of trees with animal agriculture, and I think that's a really important story for us to hear. So what I would like to, finally, I would like to welcome Dr. Fred Cabago, Assistant Commissioner at the Ugandan Ministry of Agriculture, Animal Industry and Fisheries. Dr. Kabago is a soil scientist with over 30 years' experience working with smallholder farmers. His main focus is on agroecology and food systems, sustainable utilisation of the natural resources for sustained production and ecosystem resilience. He's the national focal point for the United Nations Convention to combat desertification. I can never say that properly. Anyway, thank you. I will hand the floor over to you, Dr. Kabago. Kabango, I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would just like to have a discussion of what we are doing and at the government level actually, because we've heard what farmers are going through as far as agroecology is concerned. And in my own understanding and the way we look at it is a traditional way of how people have been doing their agriculture. Before, I think, the Green Revolution, people were working, people were doing their agriculture in the traditional way, and we think that was a safe way, really, to produce. And ecosystems were more resilient than what we see today. Today, what we see are systems which are making our farmers more reliant on external inputs. And by so doing, we have even categorized them as resource-poor farmers because they cannot afford, for example, fertilizers, name it. Whereas that time they could produce enough food. And also, another important issue there is safe food for them. Ecosystems were okay, ecosystems were alive, and ecosystems did not have what we see today as pollutants and whatever. So we feel like agroecology is one of the ways which we need to look at critically. And actually, at government level, we have had the opportunity to interact with more of our colleagues like Lamin here, and agroecology is one of the topics which we have included as for discussion, I believe, for discussion here. And we've been pushing through parties to ensure that is there. And even in our position paper from the country, agroecology is one of the approaches we feel really can emancipate our farmers and bring about safe foods to the table. So that is one of the issues. Uganda is one of the countries which has passed a policy on organic agriculture. Actually, we passed it in 2021. Yeah. And also African Union, I think, has a call on parties to have ecological organic agriculture. I think that was 2019, if I remember well. There is an AU decision on that, so we are trying to implement that AU decision also on organic agriculture. So as a country, that's what we see as one of the issues. As under our NDCs, that is not new now. I think all of us now know the national determined contribution is some of the strategies we have put in our NDC is having agroecology as one of the approaches we need to look at to ensure sustainable and resilient communities. So under one, we also have the framework, which is NAP, National Adaptation Plan for Agriculture 2018, emphasizing having agroecology as one of the approaches we really need to push if we want to build climate resilient communities in our country. So at the institutional level, that is where we are. But at the same time, Uganda hosts the Center of Excellence for Agroecology. Uganda Matters University is one of the centers of excellence for agroecology. If you Google it from the website, you will see it. So what are we trying to do is to ensure that we can inculcate that in our students who go out and eventually become change agents. So we are sponsoring students at the master's level and the undergraduate level, and also PhDs at that level, to ensure that we have more ambassadors who can lobby and advocate for agroecology as a system we need to embrace. And then another one is the strategy. As a ministry, we are trying to develop a strategy for agroecology. How are we doing it? We are trying to work with CSOs or civil societies who can lobby and advocate for it. We are working with them to have a strategy on agroecology, and it is already under review in the ministry to see how best can we have this traditional farming actually taking place, and also reducing vulnerability of our communities to industrialized kind of approaches in crop production. And then another one is the platforms. We formed the platforms in 2019. We have platforms at national level of different stakeholders who are like-minded people, who feel like we need to have safe foods, we need to have resilient ecosystems in the country, other than talking about it and looking for external funding now and then, whereas there are some things which can be done, really. So we have platforms at the country level, which we are looking at, which can help us bring stakeholders together. And we are also looking at networks in other countries. Those who are like-minded people like us, who feel like agroecology is one of the way to go, then we can look at means of implementation. How do we get the technology and different practices which other countries are doing, which we may need to look at also and inculcate them into our farming systems. The financing mechanisms, technology transfer and development, research. So we are looking at all those kind of networks which can help us have our agroecology being taken on seriously. Challenge has been, and the question has always been, with the growing population. Uganda, we are at 3.2 growth rate per annum. How are we going to do it? These are some of the things we need to come up with as we sit together. How do we make those means of implementation I've talked about, 3 of them, meet those challenges that come along with people who want to oppose? Because having these in negotiations is not easy. We have so many different approaches from different countries and the way people think. The Industrial Revolution plus the Green Revolution was looking at having industrialized kind of approaches as a panacea, but it has not worked also. It hasn't worked either. So going back to our traditional methods of production, especially agroecology, may be a way to go. And everybody wants safe foods. I'm sure there are now green markets for good things like that, and people want to live. All of us are looking for longer lives. So there are some ways, things we can do. So, Madam, I think let me stop here. That's what I had to present as a conversation with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Impeccable timing. So thank you, Dr. Kabango, for the overview of how the Ugandan government sees agroecology and also how you're working with students and NGOs and other organisations to make sure that it's a part of the food system and farming practices in Uganda. So with that, I would like to very much thank all of our panellists. I would also like to now open the floor for any questions. We have some time for questions. I want people, though, please to ask questions, not make speeches, please. So if you can keep your questions fairly brief. Happy to have further debate and discussion afterwards, but for now, anyway, without further ado, because otherwise I'll take up all the question time, I think there was a gentleman. Did you have your hand up over here? Yeah. Oh, there's a mic coming to you. Thanks, Karina. Is the mic working, tech people?
The mic is working? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My name is Bashir. I'm from Somalia. And this discussion is it's very interesting. Sorry. Why it is so interesting to me is though we are instructed that we don't have to make a statement, so another discussion is Somalia has a large livestock population with estimated 7.1 million of camels, around 4 million of cattle, and 40 million goats, 13 million sheep. So I actually wonder why this also, we don't have a Somali panelist. But anyways, I agree and I echo with the panelist here, and that the major problem now is the disproportionate or the victimization of this part of the world by the what is happening in the developed countries. So right now, like my country is having this floods, which is one time it is the drought for 6-7 years in successive, and then the second day or the second year, the same water is killing or destruction of the infrastructure of the animals. So one, if I just make it short, a question I would to ask is that while we go against the industry farming, and as well as also the protection of the livestock, how you think that the global south or the African countries can be in a place where they are given a special considerations in the support of the loss and the damage, but also which other options or alternative rather than going for the farming or farming for factories. So I mean the making these companies to produce this meat to feed the people, how this can be achieved while also we keep protecting the livestock or the animals.
Thank you for that question. I'll just see if there's another. I'll take a couple of questions because we've got, I'll see how much time we've got. So we'll come to that question. Thank you very much. I'll take another one. This gentleman.
Thank you very much. My name is Faustin Vuningoma. I come from Rwanda. There has always been a question. My question goes to Fred Kavango. There has always been a question of discussing whether agroecology can feed the growing population globally. And nations sometimes tend to stick on that. But I want to come back to your country because I have some experience in that country. In the past, when people were practicing agroecology in its real terms, food used to come from the villages to the city. These days, you find Ugandans taking food from the city to the villages, which means something has gone wrong. Now, if there is doubt that agroecology is not going to feed the growing population, is factory farming feeding them? We are talking about issues of malnutrition, undernourishment, poor foods. Sometimes we even talk about foods that can contribute to cancer diseases and other things of the like. How are we trying to harmonize, or how are we trying to balance growing food that is safe, nutritious, but equally sufficient to feed the growing population? And when you go to terms of subsidies, we have subsidized a lot in terms of factory farming. When do we start to subsidize in terms of agroecology and then see things going right. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there one more question over there? Yeah, okay. So that'll be the last question, and then I'm going to ask for some responses. Go ahead.
Thank you. There's Rakesh Warrior from BIF Development Research Foundation, India. We have been working in livestock development for over 5 decades in India. My question is to the speaker from Senegal. Apologies for missing out the name. So you mentioned a very, very important point on livestock being a net negative emitter. So can you please specify what are some of the activities that you have taken up which have led to the situation of livestock being a net negative emitter? Because that's a very important point which you brought up. Thank you.
And thank you for your brevity in the question. So what I'd like to do is basically we had a question directly to Dr. Kambango, and then we had and then we had the question about the Senegalese case study around the mixed agriculture there. And then a question, so I'll ask you two gentlemen to respond specifically to those questions that were asked directly to you. But then we had a question at the beginning around, actually it's also similar to the question about global safe, nutritious food, and sort of what are the alternatives for Africa. So let me give you two both an opportunity, Dr. Kambango and Lamine Diata, to respond, and then I'll see if any of the other panellists want to add, given that some questions were asked direct to you. So could I hand over to one of you first?
Thank you very much, and thank you, my colleague from my neighbor, actually, because we share similar challenges and also sentiments, and ecosystems and agrosystems are the same, more or less. Actually, what you see is what people have been made to believe, as I said. Depending on external inputs generally, think that it is a panacea, which is not true. We need to go back and tell them that our traditional methods of production, if they are sustained, is the way to go. If we are to go to fight against malnutrition and unsafe foods, traditional methods of farming, that is agroecology, is the way to go. And what we need now is technologies elsewhere. What are they not doing, those who are already there? And then how do we bring them back to board so that they can realize that they have resources around them? Because this is a systems approach which we need to look at so that those agro ecosystems can really survive. So that's what I think. We need to do more through our platforms, as I said, and then the legal frameworks. We are trying to review some of these issues so that we can really have agroecology also inculcated, deeply rooted, and also capacity building of our farming system, farming communities. That's why I said we are also trying to use universities to train people, ambassadors, food soldiers, to go out there with good knowledge and attitude. So we have a lot to talk about, but just let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Inja, for this question. So for this one, I previously separated two kind of livestock, or three, but the most important one. We are not in house boundary systems. We are in open livestock systems in grassland. And in our countries, when we say grassland, in reality, it's savannas, it's forest land. So with better forest management, we organize those livestock people in a manner they reduce the overgrazing, and they protect more the area, and they allow sometimes some tree regeneration. So when we estimate annual sequestration in biomass and soil carbon, and we compare with the emission from animal on that area in this year, we see that sometimes the emissions are negative. We have more sequestration in biomass and soil more than emission from those livestock. Yeah, but it's in specific area, not in house boundary systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I am going to make a brief comment and then wrap us up, just in the interest of time and fairness to the next people who are running a side event in here. So what I'd also just like to add to those, in response to some of those questions, is that clearly it is the responsibility of the Global North to take action to ensure that the Global South actually has safe, nutritious food. So it's really important that we see action being taken in the Global North. We need to see meat reduction there, protein transition. We need to see financial support in terms of adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, so that traditional agroecological smallholder producer agriculture can be protected and expanded to feed local communities. We also need to make sure that subsidies are actually redirected towards addressing food security and food sovereignty actually on the ground. Some of the companies, the big agribusiness companies we're talking about, they're making record profits. They are actually damaging the environment. They need to be held responsible, and they need to actually contribute to that loss and damage. So with that, what I'd like to do is thank everybody for their participation today. There are paper copies of some of us who have presented today of research and packs. There's some copies of also World Animal Protection's research available. We've had a QR code up there, and I think Salawi has some research papers there that she may have already distributed. So with that, really like to thank you all for your participation, for listening to us, for asking your questions. We are all available outside if anyone wants to ask any questions. And with that, and with 2 minutes 41 to spare, we will wrap up. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panellists.